Yeah, hi. I'm Dr. Ben Newman. I'm a coronavirus researcher with, 20 some years of experience working on these things. And so this is Ask Dr. Ben, and I'm going to do another one of these. It's been a couple of weeks. Yeah, for sure. All right. So the next question is we're not going to say who it's from, but I'm seeing an overwhelming amount of information saying how horribly bad and dangerous the COVID vaccines are. I've seen some of this too. Yeah. The question continues. I've had 5 injections. Great. Yeah. So I hope this is not true. I don't want to bother Dr. Ben, but do you think you might be able to say a few words about vaccine safety? Yeah, sure. I'll do my best. Yeah. All right. So, yeah, it's a good question. And I've seen a couple of things too. I don't think it is just related to Twitter because that's only just starting. So there will be Twitter nonsense headed your way in no time at all. Yeah. I think this is probably still older Facebook nonsense, which is not Facebook's fault. It's just this is how people talk to each other. And so, yeah, it's out there in the world. There was a thing about 2 weeks ago, sort of people talking about a study where they were saying that the mRNA vaccinations are causing horrible fertility problems. And that we can do that one, or like in general, there isn't any data to back up those assumptions. But let's zoom in on the microcosm of this one study because that may be something that you've heard about. So the idea is that you get a COVID vaccine and then bad things happen to your baby and any babies in the future, like indefinitely somehow. Yeah, as if a body that can't remember the coronavirus for more than 6 months somehow remembers to attack you for like years after. Yeah, which is not how anything works. Because it's the same immune system that will be doing the attacking. And so there's really no way for it to be both off and on, in other words. So the crux of this paper was that they looked at the VAERS database. So this is US specific, but there are similar things in most other countries. And so this is adverse events reporting. And what they were doing is comparing adverse events after flu vaccinations, because this is coming from one of those like trains of thought where like the old things are okay. And so they're not saying all vaccines are bad. They're saying old vaccines that are made of broken pieces of protein and broken viruses are okay, but the new vaccines are bad. Yeah. Which, I don't know. With all new things, there's going to be some pushback. And especially, I think the new vaccines seem a lot more different than they are, because they're really just an efficient way, like a more efficient way of doing the same thing. The idea would be analogous to, let's say you need some eggs. So you could go to the store and get 6 eggs, and if you run into some bumpy road, you hit a pothole, and the eggs fall over, maybe they don't make it all the way home. Maybe you only get 3 eggs, maybe you get 2 eggs. Maybe you've got the dog running loose in the back of your car, as he sometimes does in ours, and he eats some of the eggs. Yeah. So there's a lot of bad things that can happen because eggs are fragile. And this is like the old vaccines. You're putting in proteins that are kind of fragile, and you're hoping that they make it intact all the way through all these bad things that happen to proteins in the body all the time. We recycle them very aggressively. And basically, if you recycle too much before they can get to the immune system and get processed in a certain way, then there's really not much left, and you don't get much of a response. Like you put in the right amount of vaccine, but you get very little bang for your buck. Yeah, again, a little more American than it needs to be. With the mRNA vaccine, it's just like putting a chicken in there, but it's a very short-lived chicken. It's like a James Bond chicken. You know how James Bond had those secret messages that would self-destruct after you read them? This is like that. So instead of putting in the protein and hoping that the protein which you farmed up in the lab. You grew all this stuff up, and then you put it in the vials, and you made sure to try and keep the vials nice and cold all the way until they make it to the clinic. And then there they put the little syringe in there, and passing proteins up and down a syringe is really hard on those proteins. There's like a lot of shear force as you go through that narrow needle. And so sometimes that can shred the proteins, and doctors aren't thinking in terms of, I must be extremely gentle when, taking this out. They're thinking, I've got another 50 people to vaccinate. Yeah, let's keep the line moving. Is at least what I would be thinking if I was one of those doctors, which I am not. Yeah, not that kind of doctor. And so you put that in, and then you're just putting it randomly into a muscle, hoping that it will run into some of the right cells, and eventually, they'll recognize this as something foreign, and then they'll start to make a response, and they'll go talk to other cells in the immune system. It's a long process to actually get from vaccine goes in to you have some kind of protection against the virus. The mRNA vaccine, instead of trying to put this super delicate thing in there, you just put in a message that will code for this thing. And so the cells will make it for you. And so all the problems of like farming up the protein and transporting the protein and not destroying the protein as you're putting it in go away, because you're making the protein inside the cells. And so now the protein is there. And the other nice thing is that the RNA goes away. It has a really short half-life. So it's completely gone within a week, and it's about halfway gone within a day. About 20 hours, they think, is the half-life of this thing. And once it's gone, it's just gone. All you have left are some memory T cells and B cells, sort of memory cells from the immune system, that will hopefully remember the shape of the spike protein. Because all the immune system works on shape. They're just sort of blind little cells feeling around in the dark. And if they happen to make the right shape sort of receptor, then they can bind onto the spike protein, the right shape protein, and they can recognize. And if they recognize, then they can do something about the problem. Anyway, so this paper was comparing the rates of different problems in that database. And I think most of the studies that I've seen that have been not very well done, but have pointed toward the vaccines being dangerous, they mostly seem to be taken from this particular database. And there are some caveats there. So growing up in the US, I had lots of vaccines, polio, influenza, whatever. Yeah. Hepatitis B. You got that when you start working with blood products. And all these vaccines over the years, it's fine, but I was never given the code for the VAERS database, the Adverse Events Reporting System database. And it was actually up and running for a long time, for much of my life, but it was really small. And at first, people didn't know about it. It was just maybe a few physicians who would know about it. And they were more the ones who were putting these events in, or you'd have to like write a letter off to VAERS and, lick a stamp and put it on there, to get your story included in that database. And so there are very few from the early years, and they definitely don't record anything. And what it turns out was that they're comparing this to the COVID vaccine, which basically everybody got several times. And so you've got millions and millions of people getting this. And this was also done in the era of mobile phones. And so everybody, including me, gets a little code, like you can put in your symptoms. And if you're in the US, you've probably seen this. You got the three little, smiley face, neutral face, and unhappy face. You sort of rate how you're feeling, and then, is there any way it could have been related to the vaccine? And you put this data in. So we've basically only been doing this recently, and the way you compare this is you compare the trend after vaccination to the same window of time but with no vaccination. And so there are big national databases where you can do this. What they compare it to in the papers is often the same database, but from 20 years earlier, back when nobody knew about it. And for whatever reason, there's a very low amount of normal things that show up in there. So very low amounts of deaths in general, lower than normal amounts of miscarriages, things like that. Part of that is due to the people who were being vaccinated. So with the flu vaccine in particular, we tend to vaccinate mostly people who are 50 plus. And so I can think of a couple reasons why people who are over 50 might not be reporting menstrual trouble, or, that the vaccine has caused a miscarriage or something. Because, generally, you've done all that stuff years earlier. And, that's just the way time goes. That's just the way everything goes. And so, they come to these conclusions saying, whoa, look at this. These two things are different. We used all these fancy statistical tests. And that's fine. A statistical test is just like a really accurate little ruler or measuring tape. You can say, okay, is this thing different than this other thing? Yes or no. Yeah, that's the only real question that statistics answer in practical use. Problem is, you're measuring a thing that's very incomplete. You're trying to measure the idea of a thing when you're measuring these 20-year-old data sets. It's like, how big is a feeling, and stretching out your little measuring tape and saying, about 2.95 centimeters, more or less, plus or minus. When the answer is that you shouldn't be measuring that thing. It's not the right tool for that job. And so they're using a legitimate measuring stick, legitimate data from the SARS-CoV-2, which turns out to be exactly on par with expectations. Adjusted miscarriage rate, I think in the US is something like 12% of pregnancies end in miscarriage, and the adjusted one from the data set was, I think it was like 1/10% lower or something like that after the vaccination, which is to say that there was no significant difference between those. But they're just comparing it to an older data set where that was not recorded. So I don't know what that means. It's like, I don't know, if you pick up a copy of a really ancient Bible or something like that, and you're looking for, is transsexual in there? And you say, no, it's not in there. Therefore, whatever. It's just, a different time, different way of doing things. It's the wrong test to come to that conclusion. The other thing you notice about most of the studies where they say that vaccines are dangerous, it's really interesting to look through the affiliations. On the one that I'm thinking of, which is this VAERS and flu one from a couple weeks ago, there were people that listed themselves as citizen scientists. There were people that listed themselves as activists. There was somebody from a lawyer's office. There was a person who had once worked in an OB/GYN clinic. And there was nobody in there who had ever, as far as I could tell, published anything about a virus, coronavirus, or really, would have any idea of what they're doing. And to some extent, this is how everybody learns. You go into a new field and you learn from other people, and in the absence of other people, you do your best. So I like the human aspect of that. It's people trying something new. But just like if you were to sit down and say, I'm gonna play some Chopin on the piano, having never played the piano before, your first attempt probably wouldn't be the one you'd want to put on the CD. Or you could put in the TikTok as the before and then show you several years later with it totally mastered. That would be a very nice video. But first attempts often aren't the best. So from the sort of scientific perspective, like looking at sort of major journal articles by people who know what they're doing and are watching this stuff, I can't see any evidence that the vaccines are doing anything with any kind of long-term consequence. What we see is that the side effects are a little less with each subsequent vaccination, and that's very good. Yeah. Not a ton less though, so like I've still felt like trash, rubbish for the British friends for about a day after the last vaccine, and it would be nice if we could get to the stage where I didn't. But at the same time, the way vaccines work is, in general, like from animal studies and everything else, the harder you push, the better results you tend to get. So if you generate a lot of inflammatory response, if you generate a larger immune response, you will feel worse, definitely, but you will also have a greater effect of the vaccine. And so they're doing their best to try to come to a balance between those things. Like, how much do we need to do the job versus how much could we use to do an optimal job, but we might cause a person to feel more sick. And it's a reasonable balance, just because if anything, I wish I would spend 2 days feeling really bad if the vaccine worked and lasted twice as long. That would be a fine trade-off for me, but I can understand why it might not be for everybody else. So yeah, there's no long-term danger in this, because the mRNA vaccines in particular are not long-term vaccines. There's no component in there that can survive in the body for very long at all. So yeah, it's all right. And so what I'd say in terms of the question, I'm glad you had the 5 injections, and with 5, I'm betting you got the new Omicron booster. At least in the US right now, we're at about 10%, I believe, of the country that has actually had the booster. So you're doing your best. You're doing your part. I wish everybody else did as well. I'm trying my best as well. And don't worry about the safety. If something changes, I'll let you know, and I'll certainly be interested to read about that. But when you do a test on one person and you get a result, you can say, well, maybe it's a fluke. And then you do the test 10 times and you say, well, okay, maybe there's a little hint of a trend. Do it 1,000 times, you're like, yeah, that's a pretty solid trend. Do this thing millions and millions of times, billions of times in the case of some of these vaccines, and with a data set that size, you can actually be very confident in saying that these vaccines do not do any long-term harm that anybody's been able to find. And they do a very good job of protecting against COVID. Yeah. So yeah, I don't know what else you want in a vaccine. So yeah, thank you for the question, and I hope you're well, and you're doing the right thing, and thank you. How's that? All right. This has been Ask Dr. Ben.